Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, honoring Arbor Day on April 26th, with an ongoing commitment to sustainable stewardship and conservation of Missouri's forests. ChooseWood.com.
The Gateway brings you the day's news from the St. Louis region and across Missouri. It also includes stories from the Illinois side of the river and our Metro East reporter, Will Bauer.
In Alton, in Belleville, in East St. Louis, in Edwardsville, in Cahokia Heights, at Scott Air Force Base, I'm Will Bauer, St. Louis Public Radio.
Listen to reports from Will and all of our journalists weekdays on the Gateway, on the STLPR app, and wherever you get podcasts.
From St. Louis Public Radio. This is St. Louis on the Air.
There were things about writing about her that were freeing.
Think of her as someone outside yourself. Maybe be kinder to her than you would to yourself.
I think exactly. She's encountering herself. I was going to be able to look at the world not just through my protagonist's eyes, but through the eyes of the people that she met.
I'm Sarah Fensky. Margaret Hermes began writing her new novel 39 years ago. She was a new divorcee traveling in Europe when she wrote the first chapter of a novel about a new divorcee traveling in Europe. Now, she hastens to add that the main character wasn't really her. She wrote a few chapters, but then she shelved them. Almost 4 decades passed before she returned to the book, finished it, and got it published. The book is called The Opposite of Chance, and joining us today to talk about it is Margaret Hermes. She is a writer who grew up in Chicago and has been based in St. Louis for the past 44 years. Margaret, welcome.
Thank you. Very happy to be here.
So, Margaret, your novel is about a woman named Betsy. What do we know about her as the story begins?
Well, Betsy is 32 years old in 1981, so her childhood spanned the 1950s in Milwaukee, and she was very much a product of that time and that place. She would have been the kind of kid who was a proud member of the Clean Plate Club, as well as a loyal follower of the Mickey Mouse Club. So she was a good girl. And she attended Catholic schools from kindergarten through graduate school. She was not only growing up in a sheltered environment in Milwaukee, she just stayed in Milwaukee. She was there following her early marriage and then after her divorce. And despite her longing to travel, she never even left the Midwest until she takes off on her trip when she goes solo backpacking through Europe.
Solo backpacking through Europe. So that is a big step for somebody who's never left the Midwest. Is she prepared for what greets her?
Not at all.
And I guess that's there is the drama of the novel, right? Is her encountering this whole new world.
Her encountering the people, the customs, the very, very different places, but also I think of it as an internal journey as well. I mean, she's encountering herself in these various supposedly chance relationships.
So you mentioned these relationships, and this book does have a very unusual structure that I ended up just appreciating so much. We get one chapter about Betsy, and then it's followed by a chapter where we get to know somebody that she has met, and in some ways we grow to understand them in much different ways by how we might see them through her eyes. I'm wondering if that was always the plan going into this book, that you'd have her perspective alternate with all these other characters who also find themselves in Europe.
When I set out to write the stories about Betsy, they were going to be simply stories about Betsy. They were, I assumed, going to be a novel, but I was happy to treat them as a collection of connected stories as well. And I wrote the first 3 stories, submitted them to literary magazines. They were published. And then when I was about to tackle the 4th, I realized that I was not engaged in the novel in the way that I should be. And I realized it was because Betsy's perspective was narrow. Her focus was narrow, and her processing of the world that she engaged with was also limited. So I became stuck, really stuck, and I put that aside for, 25 years later.
Wow.
I was in an airport in Montreal and was beginning what was a difficult trip. I had lost my passport at the outset. Lots of things had gone wrong, and I was feeling fairly glum. And I was sitting in this airport when this startlingly handsome Muslim man came and said his prayers, and I watched him intently. I really, at the time, felt I had never seen anyone so gorgeous. I was transfixed, and what I was very much aware of was that he had his hair very badly dyed at some point, and the gray was growing out. And for some reason, for which I'm grateful, I have no idea why, but this man stuck in my brain, and I would periodically think about him and think about writing about him. And one day when I went back to the idea of tackling the Betsy stories, something really clicked, and I thought, this man was going to be my entry back into those stories. I was going to be able to look at the world not just through my protagonist's eyes, but through the eyes of the people that she met. And that gave me the structure.
And this does end up becoming such a wonderful story in this novel. You sort of draw on imagining this man's world, and we see the world through his eyes. But that can be such a tightrope act for an author, that you're not just writing about the world through the perspective of a Midwestern woman. You're now doing this through somebody who has such a different background than yourself. Did you have some trepidation beginning to write about this man?
Great trepidation. I, in fact, spent months. I can't even begin to tell you how much time I spent in research on this book, but I certainly read as much as I could about making a pilgrimage to Mecca. And in doing that, I was, really concerned, of course, with trying to represent the trappings, the visuals, to put it in that kind of a context, which wouldn't, I thought, be familiar to many readers. But also, I had to really work to try and get a picture of the religious aspects of it and the exteriors, but also the internal spiritual journey that this man was on. So I was very, very trepidatious. And finally, after having written it and coming close to the publication of the novel, I did approach 3 Bosnian Muslim friends and had them go over it with a fine-tooth comb, and was really relieved. They did find one thing that I was very happy that they noted that I needed to change.
So you did make a change based on it, but it sounds like all that research did pay off. Like, for the most part, this was something that rang true to them.
Very, very much so. I was really heartened by their response.
So you mentioned all the research that went into this, and that was very clear to me reading this book. And I wouldn't say that this is the most obvious thing. This isn't what will strike people maybe when they first read it. It's a great yarn. You can follow it just like a story. But I kept thinking, wow, like, she knows so much about what life would have been like for an Irish man living in 1981, which is, again, this is something that's different from your worldview. Is this part of why, even after you picked this book up 25 years later, there were years before you were ready to submit this to a publisher?
No, that's exactly true. That, and I have to say that I also, during those years, I was spending a lot of time working on environmental issues. So I would take time off from the book and devote myself to my other hobby. But the thing about the research was that sometimes it just became overwhelming. I particularly, the research that I did on the Irish hunger strike and Bobby Sands, the book would have been 30 pages longer if my editor hadn't put his red pen to the
He had to pull that back a bit.
He really did. I was turning it into a history textbook or a dissertation. The novel was definitely suffering from my overwhelmingly methodical research. I even was including bits and pieces from Bobby Sands's diaries, songs, poems. I went too far.
So you went all in on the Troubles. I mean, it is certainly a great, huge subject. I can see how you were so attracted to it. Was it hard then to follow your editor's lead and prune that back?
Yes, it was. But I knew he was right. We didn't always agree on things. The editing process for us, I think, was a continuing negotiation. But he was absolutely right about my toning down the chapter that would have been tantamount to 4 other chapters in the novel.
We're talking today to the author Margaret Hermes. Her new book is The Opposite of Chance. This was a book that was 4 decades in gestation, tells the story of a Midwestern woman who sees her eyes open, and we meet a number of other characters along the way as she travels through Europe. So, Margaret, talking about Bobby Sands, one interesting part about this book, as I mentioned, you started it when you yourself were on a trip to Europe, but you ended up setting this in a different year than the year that you were there. And part of what was so interesting to me is you just changed it by 1 year. This isn't a big enough change that you wanted to introduce new technology or the world had changed in dramatic ways. What made you shift that timeline?
Well, because you're absolutely right. It was the hunger strike was a big reason for that. But there were also other things going on in the United States and in Europe. There was the marriage of Diana and Charles, which figured more prominently in my manuscript than it did in the final book. There were things like the baseball strike in the United States, all sorts of things that I felt would help the reader to set it in time much more than occurred in 1982, but also in the fact of the hunger strike and Bobby Sands. I mean, that was material that I really wanted to use, and 1982 would have been not the right year for that. So I did take the liberty of changing the year, but I also wanted to keep it very much close to the time in which I had taken my own trip, because I took, as a person traveling alone often does, extensive notes. I actually had notebooks filled with things with wonderful descriptions, I thought, that I used in the novel, but also with details like train schedules and even the contents of museums. So I was able to really rely on my notes from that trip that I had taken a year after the setting.
And so we know the notes came in handy and the era came in handy. I'm wondering how much Betsy as a character draws on you. Certainly on paper, in a 1-sentence description, it seems like Betsy is you. But you've said that's not the case.
Well, I think it's not. For one thing, Betsy, a big part of Betsy's experience as a traveler is her childlessness. And I, in fact, had 2 young children at the time.
Wow. You were able to do this kind of trip. You didn't take the children, obviously.
I did not. And that's another story for another time.
Sure. But that is a big difference. I mean, certainly this is something that Betsy, the fictional character, has grappled with in her marriage, is
right.
The childlessness.
Right. And that is a huge theme. And I think there were many ways in which I felt I was dissimilar from the character. And because of that, I think I had a real affection for her.
You were able to think of her as someone outside yourself, maybe be kinder to her than you would to yourself?
I think exactly. I mean, she is clearly flawed, and as are we all. But there were things about writing about her that were freeing for me as a person as well. The very fact that, from my perspective, Betsy, a big part of her journey was learning to trust. And I found that it's sort of understood that when someone has gone through a divorce, there's often trust issues that one feels for the opposite gender. Mm-hmm. And yet, in my mind, the biggest trust issues that one has to deal with following a divorce is learning how to trust yourself, learning how to trust your own judgment, not feeling that one is a victim, but that one is an active participant in one's own life.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel like your trip to Europe that you took after your divorce helped you come to terms with some of those same issues?
Well, I think it did. It gave me a lot of distance from my particular situation, and it also opened me up to so many things. I mean, including friendships that carried on over time. That stemmed from that trip. It was a wonderful, freeing experience. And I like my protagonist, I was really alone for the first time. And I had also married young, and I had my children, and I was never responsible for myself in the way that I was on this trip. Mm. I'm responsible for entertaining myself as well as for, making all the practical decisions.
You really had to get to know yourself in such an intimate way, being on the road with yourself and only yourself.
I did, and sometimes it was an extremely lonely experience, as I think solo travel is, but it was also a wonderful opportunity to explore my inner and the world, my inner landscape as well.
So I feel like this is such a good advertisement for people taking that plunge and traveling on their own. But I also feel like this book now coming to completion and how wonderfully it turned out, it's also maybe a reminder that if you have chapters tucked away somewhere, but those chapters keep sort of nibbling at you, that this is something that this is a new year. This is maybe a chance to revisit it. Do you feel like in some ways there was a cleansing that was involved in finishing this book that you couldn't let go?
Yeah, I was so pleased to see this finally be published because I had put so much of myself into it over such a long period of time. And it's interesting that you talk about something else surfacing. What I'm working on now, I had been working on a play when the pandemic hit, mm-hmm. and then I was engrossed with revising the novel and working with my editor. And then I thought I would be going back to the play, but somehow working on a theater piece during a time when theaters were dark just didn't somehow work for me.
Yeah.
So I was really searching for something, and I wanted something wildly different from what I had done before. In a sense, it was ironic because I did pick up something I had done before. I'd written a children's book many years ago that has not yet been published, and I decided to try to illustrate the book.
Wow. This has been a really creative time for you. I mean, you're taking big risks with your art.
Well, this is a risk in that I am definitely not an artist. I can't draw. So to create the illustrations for this book, I've relied on collage. And I have to say that this is something, this project has been bringing me real joy. I have had the pleasure of working with my hands, the pleasure of using my brain in a different way, but also being somebody who has a house that is sinking in clutter. I have had just the sheer fun of making these collages with only things that I find on my shelf or in my drawer. And there's only one thing that I purchased during the course of creating these, and that was a scouring pad that I needed to make some hair. I couldn't find anything else that worked quite the same.
But everything else, this was found objects.
Absolutely, and so much fun. I mean, a little old pocket watch of my father's, a twig from the garden, shells that I had collected as a child. So you can imagine how much clutter there is in this house.
Well, Margaret, I think this is just wonderful. I feel like this is maybe the perfect way for us here on St. Louis on the Air to start the new year. I mean, just hearing the buoyancy in your voice and these creative projects. I hope that if people are feeling stuck, I hope they're listening to this, because it's been so exciting to hear. And also to talk about this wonderful book that, 4 decades later, here it is among us. So, Margaret, I want to thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you. It's been fun for me.
This episode was produced by Sarah Fensky, with audio engineering by Aaron Dorr and production assistance from Jane Mather-Glass. It was mixed and edited by Jane. Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here. If you learned something new from today's episode, consider leaving us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the easiest way to help people discover our show. We appreciate it. Thank you. St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri, St. Louis.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, honoring Arbor Day on April 26th, with an ongoing commitment to sustainable stewardship and conservation of Missouri's forests. ChooseWood.com.